You think you know your family, then one night a sibling tries to stab through your bedroom door. Content warning. These are first-person accounts that include attempted violence, criminal activity, and distressing themes. The stories you're about to hear were submitted to the channel. I'm relaying them as they were shared. Where the submitter alleges wrongdoing, I'll note that as such. The first submission arrived in an email that started the way so many of these do. Small, hesitant, and folded around a single, impossible night. The voice on the other end of the page sounded tired in print. Years of looking over their shoulder, they wrote. They asked for anonymity. They called their stepbrother Braden. Their family had already been fragile. Their mother had died when they were still young. After a long season of quiet, their father started dating a woman named Jen. She was different, the submitter said, calmer in the ways a grieving parent could be, a person who agreed on carpools and birthday cakes and who kept the house from falling apart. She moved in with her teenage son, Braden, not long after. At first, it was almost easy to pretend things were ordinary. The submitter described small warnings that, in hindsight, were the kind people file away in the corners of their lives. Braden didn't seem to know the house rhythms. He left food out. He laughed too loud at movies. He kept to himself in a way that felt like a permanent bruise. He was 14 when he moved in, an age where a lot of kids keep their worst things to themselves. The family hoped for a soft landing. It didn't land softly. The submitter's tone shifted when they described the change. Little irritations became repeated patterns. Braden's hygiene was poor in ways that made shared spaces tense. He would go long stretches without showering, or leave the bathroom in a state nobody wanted to talk about. Temper tantrums followed small denials. He ripped through rooms searching for excuses to blame someone else. Once he drove a car borrowed from a friend recklessly enough to terrify the submitter, then blamed them for not calling out his behavior. The family bristled, and Dad, who had tried to be patient, kept telling everyone to give Braden time. Alongside the behavioral alarms, there were things that felt invasive rather than merely rude. The submitter describes a pattern of manipulation, small lies that grew into larger ones, a knack for turning concern into guilt aimed at other people. Braden was good at blaming the family's grief for his own failures. He made people feel responsible for his worst moments. Then the theft started. It was banal at first, a charge that didn't make sense, a message from a gaming company about purchased points. The submitter kept a tight budget. Their credit card statements were something of a ritual. When they spotted charges that matched game purchases, digital currency for Madden, the submitter said, they assumed a friend had used their card by mistake. When they confronted Braden about it, he shrugged and said he'd been borrowing his mother's card, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the submitter checked the account history and found more. Small, repeated withdrawals, gift cards bought in the middle of the night. The pattern read like someone building a private world of purchases at somebody else's expense. According to the submitter, the theft became a battleground. They called Dad. Dad confronted Jen. Jen minimized. Braden denied. The household turned brittle. The submitter felt targeted in a way that wasn't only about money. It felt like having their sense of safety and ownership stripped away by someone who lived under the same roof. You can imagine how awkward that becomes. An accusation against a child of your partner after you've already lost so much. The submitter says their father vacillated between fury and disbelief, and then, worryingly, between saying he'd protect them and saying he couldn't afford to break up his new family. He kept the house together, with a diplomacy that sometimes felt indistinguishable from avoidance. The small thefts didn't stop the night Braden stepped into something else entirely. It was a winter evening. The submitter wrote about the particular sound of the rain on the roof, like a thin screen between them and the street. They were alone in their room, locked the way teenagers do, honest about needing space, when they say they heard a knock that was too loud to be polite. The submitter told me the knock started small and escalated, not the kind of knocking a visitor does, but pounding, frustration punctuated with intent. They opened the door a crack to see Dad standing in the hall looking ashen. The submitter described his face as white with a kind of scared anger I had never seen before. Behind him, the hallway light caught a boy with a knife. The submitter's words here are careful. They didn't want to supply verdicts. According to their account, Braden was banging on the door and stabbing at it with a pocket knife, demanding to be let in. He was shouting, the submitter says, in a voice that jittered between pleading and rage. He kept demanding a sort of confession, asking to be forgiven, needing a permission the submitter did not recognize. Dad stepped forward, and for a moment the submitter thought their father might use a weapon to stop him. Instead, he made a last raw appeal to Braden. "Get out of here. You can't keep doing this." Braden left, but not before the submitter says he slashed the door and told them they were never going to feel safe again. This part of the account is where the family's veneer cracked in a way that didn't reassemble. It's also the place where small choices, who calls the police, who keeps quiet, what is forgiven, begin to determine how a family survives trauma. According to the submitter, Dad didn't call the police that night. He took Braden to Jen's sister's house for the evening, and they all sat in the kitchen while Jen cried and the family tried to make sense of the moment. There were explanations. The submitter told me that Braden had been seeing a counselor at points, that he had been diagnosed with something that made emotion jagged, that medication helped sometimes. But what mattered in the moment was the threat in the doorway. The particular stomach lurch of knowing someone inside your home wanted through a locked door with a blade. The immediate response was decisive, and, for the family, divisive. Rather than call the police or pursue criminal charges, Dad made a plan to send Braden away. Military school, the submitter said, for 2 years. It was the kind of compromise people make when a child is both a son and the vessel of danger. If Braden was a threat at home, more structure and distance might be safer. If the submitter is to be believed, Dad hoped the discipline and distance would reset things. The submitter described the next weeks like the hollowing of a house. Braden's bedroom waited for him like a paused scene. Dad moved like someone carrying too many small decisions. Jen kept to herself. The submitter packed Braden's things, the cheap nylon duffel bag of a rushed goodbye, and watched the scene of a family rearranging itself around a new absence. They boarded him on a bus to a place with strict rules that promised control and an instructor's tone instead of unconditional presence. The 2 years in military school became a hinge for the submitter. They said they slept with the bedroom door locked for months afterward, that the sound of a car pulling into the drive could make their heart jump. They reported recurring nightmares, a brittle anger that returned like an old friend. The submitter wrote that the attempt at their door had shifted their interior geography. The house that used to hold birthdays and routines now had a corner where fear lived. There was also a quiet, corrosive thing the submitter kept circling back to, how their father handled the aftermath. Sending Braden away solved the immediate physical danger, they admitted, but it also left a strain of unresolved emotion. Dad didn't prosecute. Dad made excuses. Dad wanted the family to hold together under a new lid. The submitter alternated between understanding the reasons and resenting them. They wrote bluntly that sometimes protecting a family looks like sacrificing one child on the altar of peace. There's no neat moral code that fits into moments like that. The submitter acknowledged it. They weren't demanding Dad be the villain. They were only telling what it felt like to be the person whose door had been attacked, and then watched the accused leave under the guise of help. There's a complexity in telling these stories. Safety measures that are meant to preserve a household can also erase accountability. The submitter said he still wished the police had been called, still wanted the record of the attempt, a paperwork trail that felt like it might have made him less invisible as a victim. In the months after Braden's removal, the family learned to be cautious with each other. Visits were scheduled, supervised. Phone calls were guarded. The submitter said that when Braden returned 2 years later, he was quieter, a different weight to him, and the house did not fold back into what it had been. The submitter wanted distance. They wanted their father to see that being gentle toward a son did not require making your other child feel unsafe. That very human demand, safety without sacrifice, was for them the rawest part of the story. One of the things I keep in mind when someone sends a story like this is how ordinary the days before an event can feel. The submitter detailed, in small, exacting sentences, the ways people tried to restore normal. Dad making coffee like nothing had happened, Jen asking about work in a voice that wanted to be kind, the submitter doing laundry and counting out socks. Normalcy is the scaffolding that collapses in these moments, and the memory of it is often the most painful. We don't have criminal records to quote here, and the submitter didn't say Braden was charged with a crime. They described what happened and the choices their family made afterward. I'm relaying their account as they sent it. A terrified night, a father's attempt to balance justice and unity, a teenager sent away in lieu of prosecution, and a survivor carrying the echo of a knife at a door for years. If this is touching something for you, if it's the part where trust inside a house breaks and you can't unhear the knock, consider subscribing. I post similar narrations regularly, and there are more stories coming. The next submission opens differently. Where the first felt domestic and small in scale, this one began with admiration. A big sibling story turned on its head. Nate, according to the submitter, was the kind of older brother you wanted if you were a kid who liked airplanes and loud tools. He taught his sibling how to change a tire, how to not be afraid of skydiving in video games, how to take apart a drone and put it back together. He wore grease under his nails like a badge. Everyone who knew him said he had the hands of a mechanic and the mind of someone who could translate physics into sensible things that flew. He joined the Air Force not as a way to escape, the submitter wrote, but because he had a real love for engineering, airframes, avionics, bureaucracy of keeping something huge in the air. The submitter's voice softened when they spoke of Nate. They wrote about a man who was generous with time, who could coax a frightened kid into trying again, who loved the way engines sounded when they were healthy. For a while the family needed that confidence. Nate's achievements were like a beacon after their mother's death. He was the sibling who made the rest of them feel like they were part of something competent, responsible, and useful. Then the story darkened into secrecy. According to the submitter, Nate did work tied to projects that were, in their words, upstairs or classified. He hinted at things in conversations that were half jokes between siblings, stories of locked rooms and people who wouldn't talk to him outside of protocol. When he returned home after being put on a prolonged medical leave, he seemed older than his years, his hands flecked with tiny burns. He spoke in fragments about an investigation that had left him tired and wary. The submitter said that Nate came back frazzled and angry about something he couldn't tell anyone legally. He was defensive, cut off questions with a flat, "I can't talk about it." And then, in quieter hours, he let slip lines that fed the submitter's fear. "They don't want us to stop it," he said once. "They'll find a way to keep going." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The image the submitter passed along was of a man who had seen a warning ignored, who had tried to raise his voice and been dismissed, and whose anger turned inward into a kind of personal code. Protect the truth, even if protecting it meant isolating himself from everyone who loved him. The submitter emphasized Nate's growing paranoia in small, painfully specific ways. He started to double-check locks, to refuse to talk on his phone in crowded rooms, to pull the curtains early. He stopped sleeping in his old room because he feared there could be listening devices, the submitter wrote. He moved to a couch under a window that allowed a potential escape route. He spoke of meeting with friends from his unit to plan something, and when the submitter pressed for details, Nate would say only that they were trying to stop it, stop the project, stop the rollout, stop whatever in his instinct had felt dangerous. There are limits to how much I can say here without straying into speculation. The submitter did not provide documents or chain of command references. What they did provide was the human, the sleepless nights, the hush that fell over the household when Nate paced, the way he frightened his own parents with threats that read like desperation more than bravado. "If anyone goes looking," he allegedly told the submitter, "tell them I left town. Don't say anything else." The submitter took this as a command that grew heavier every time it was repeated. Their moral dilemma became one of the story's focal points. Do you honor someone's request to stay silent, if silence might be protecting wrongdoing? Or do you break loyalty to the brother who had once taught you how to fix a carburetor, because you fear what he might do if driven further? The submitter wrote about standing in the kitchen and listening to Nate explain why he couldn't be open, why the risk of exposure would cause irreversible damage. He was sometimes reasonable, the submitter said. Sometimes he was threatening. Once he told them, according to the account, that if anyone tried to expose what he'd seen, he'd do what it takes to keep it buried. The phrasing was vague enough to unsettle, and specific enough that the submitter could not ignore it. The family responded in different ways. Their parents attempted diplomacy, working late nights to talk to counselors and to legal advisors. Nate's friends kept visiting in small groups, leaning over engine parts and speaking in the tongue of people who lived and breathed aircraft maintenance. The submitter felt pushed to the edges of every conversation, respected but not entrusted with the truth. It made them a witness to a strange domestic theatre where trust and secrecy alternately warmed and froze the room. Then, the submitter said, Nate began to act on his fear. He met with a small group, not under the kind of small-town lighting you see at a diner, but under the hush of makeshift spaces, garages, an empty hangar on base, a back room where you could hear the pulse of fluorescent lights. He spoke with a fervor the submitter described as believing he was saving people. They argued, and sometimes those friends left convinced, and sometimes they returned furious. The submitter wrote that Nate believed higher-ups were ignoring obvious danger for the sake of budgets and promotions, and he swore he would not be complicit. Listen to how these sentences tighten. The submitter relayed late-night whisperings, heated plans that always fell short of a clear, actionable statement, and then the most ambiguous moment. One night, Nate told the submitter he had to go out. He was going to meet with friends who knew what to do. He told them not to tell anyone. He kissed his mom on the forehead like someone leaving for a year, and then he left with a duffel bag and a face the submitter described as set like an engine about to start. This is where I pause because the submitter's account shifts from the home to whatever lay beyond their view. They watched him leave. They drove to the edge of town to see if he was still there. They went to work the next day like the world had not tilted and sat in meetings with an attention that had been dulled by the sense of impending rupture. What happened next is part of the story I can't finish here without giving away a later arc. For now the submitter is left with the absence of a brother who had asked them for silence and then gone somewhere they couldn't follow. They are left with the smell of oil and the imprint of his hand on the steering wheel he loved. They are left with official responses that seem to slide between the categories of not our remit and we have no records to release. The submitter's voice in this section of their account is a slow accumulating grief mixed with a kind of hungry doubt. Was Nate right? Had he seen something genuinely dangerous, or was he a man consumed by paranoia? Did his silence protect a dangerous secret, or did silence protect him from a system that wouldn't listen? The submitter does not know, and they say so. Their doubt, if anything, intensifies the feeling of being trapped between two loyalties. Loyalty to a brother they loved, and loyalty to a set of unwritten rules about what to do when someone in your family seems capable of hurting others, or himself. The psychological pressure of holding that in one's chest is what makes these stories linger long after you close the browser. At this point in the submission, you can almost feel the story crouching, ready to pounce. The submitter gave me the small human details, the stained baseball cap Nate liked to tuck into, the way he would half smile at his sister's terrible puns, the way he couldn't sleep in a bed if he thought there was bugging. Those details make the eventual rupture feel personal and not just procedural. They make it real that a family can be undone not only by an explicit act, but by the slow, corrosive hunger of secrecy. The submitter warned that the narrative would only get darker, and for the purposes of this first part, I'll stop here so we can sit with the way secrecy warps a household. This isn't the end of Nate's story, it's the part where you understand the stakes. The submitter's last lines in this section were a question, not for me, but for themselves. If silence was what Nate wanted, then what does silence cost the family left behind? What happened next to Nate was the part of the submission that pushed the submitter out of the small private rhythms of their house and into a public, unfinished absence. The night he left with the duffel bag, face set like someone who was about to start an engine, was the last ordinary image the submitter kept. After that, everything fractured into official statements, private theories, and the kind of waiting that makes people start watching for patterns where there are none. According to the submitter, Nate's disappearance wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. He didn't sneak away in the rain or vanish in a cloud of conspiracy. He left in the middle of the night, the way someone might leave town to avoid a bad meeting. The family woke to voicemail messages, and then to the kinds of calls you don't expect from the people you love, terse, clipped, and heavy with someone else's authority. Friends called to ask if anyone had seen him. The submitter called his phone until it went to voicemail. At some point that day, the family heard from an official who said the Air Force was looking into an accident. They were told he'd been in a crash while traveling overnight. The submitter wrote the sentence as if trying to make it simple. He died in a car accident, they said, and then immediately added that nothing about the way the news arrived felt simple. The call that broke the household's temporary truce was not the close, spoken-in-the-kitchen conversation you imagine families having. It was a flat, administrative phrase delivered through a clerk who read from protocols. The submitter remembers the way their mother's hands went to her face. They remember Dad standing very still, like someone who'd always been the steady thing in the room and now had been hit by the fact of impermanence. At first, the family's response followed the script of grief, the shock, the calls to relatives, the funeral arrangements. But grief did not remove the questions that had been accumulating while Nate had been home. Why had he been so afraid? What had he been trying to stop? Who had he met with the night he left? When they began to ask those questions, the answers they received from institutions were the cold kind that often arrive after a complicated death, short, procedural, and ultimately unsatisfying. According to the submitter, the Air Force official statements were formal and tight. They issued what the family describes as a standard notification about a service member or contractor who had been in a fatal crash. In public-facing language, there was nothing about classified projects or internal disputes. When the submitter pushed, when they asked a base spokesperson for clarification, for confirmation that Nate had actually been working on anything that matched his claims, they were told there was no record they could release. There's no indication of a classified project tied to his unit, the submitter was given as an answer on the phone. Later, an official from the same branch reportedly said that certain lines of inquiry were either outside our prerogative or not within our disclosure. The phrasing was careful and non-committal, the kind of language that leaves plenty of room for families to fill the silence with suspicion. The submitter is clear about what they believe and what they can't prove. They believe Nate was trying to stop something he thought dangerous. They believe his warnings were dismissed. They believe his death, at minimum, removed a voice that could have spoken publicly. But they also admit they do not possess documents proving the existence of a program or other hard proof that would change the narrative from suspicion to fact. They use words like suspect and allegedly, and they are alive to the possibility, however small, that Nate may have been wrong or frightened in a way that exaggerated a real but less sinister truth. What made their grief more complex, the submitter writes, was one specific detail: the timing. Nate had left overnight. He had been evasive beforehand. He had told them to say he left town if anyone asked. And then he was dead in the kind of incident that is sadly common enough to be called an accident. A car crash that occurs on a stretch of road at night. The family wanted a seam of clarity, a report that explained exactly where he had been going, who he'd met, what the vehicle's speed was, whether anyone else had been involved. Instead, the official record they were given was thinner than they needed. In the months that followed, the submitter describes a series of private attempts to understand. They wrote letters to representatives. They asked for more detailed coroner's reports. They queried veterans' advocacy groups. Some people in Nate's old units offered sympathetic ears and stories of bureaucratic indifference. Others were cagey, offering only what seemed like procedural compassion. We sympathize, without the kind of transparency a grieving family wants when questions burn. The submitter's notebook filled with small notes and names they had tried to call. Each unanswered line was a small theft, an explanation withheld. There were, alongside this investigative hunger, the human costs. Nate's parents had to go through a funeral alone, in the way that so many families do now in late-night emails and scheduled visits. There were the mundane obligations, cancelling subscriptions, handling benefits, paying for the things that come after a death, that sit beside the emotional work of mourning. The family also had to manage the suspicious looks of others. Neighbors who had once admired Nate's hands of grease now spoke in softer tones. Friends with military ties offered condolences that sometimes arrived dressed in protocol. The submitter says their grief had the strange texture of someone who had been proud of a brother, and then was left with the mess of unanswered warnings and an official narrative that simply didn't encompass what he'd said he'd seen. One of the hardest parts the submitter returned to in their writing was the way people's private stories diverge after someone dies suddenly. Some friends and colleagues defended Nate publicly, calling him diligent or tough. Others drew a quieter line. He was under a lot of stress, they said, as if stress could absolve responsibility for anything that might have followed from his plans. The submitter writes about a conversation with one of Nate's old instructors, who privately told them to be careful about chasing theories. "Let the process do its work," the instructor said, and the submitter felt simultaneously consoled and exasperated. Comforted that someone in Nate's world acknowledged his competence, frustrated that the process often acts like a slow, toothless mechanism when families need answers. There were also the select few moments that felt like confirmation of Nate's fears, small, mostly circumstantial threads that the family couldn't weave into a solid cloth. The submitter mentions receiving an anonymous note that said, in line-skimmed handwriting, "Some things are better left in the hangar." There were a couple of emails with server headers that traced back to organizational addresses that yielded no further answers. And there was the way some members of Nate's old team suddenly stopped returning calls. None of this amounted to an evidentiary trail. Taken together, though, these small absences and dashed conversations formed a larger atmospheric pressure that pushed the submitter toward suspicion. It is important to note, as the submitter does, that institutional reticence is not proof of malfeasance. Organizations that work with sensitive technologies have rules about disclosure. People make mistakes. Paranoia can be a product of grief. The submitter knows this and says so. They balance the possibility that they were living through a misinterpretation with the persistent gut sense that Nate's claims had a kernel of truth. We are left, as listeners, with that uneasy cognitive dissonance. A talented engineer gone, a family with questions, an institution that declines to satisfy those questions publicly. There is also the private shadow the submitter says lived inside their home after Nate's death, where before they had been a repository of instructions, how to change a tire, how to take apart a controller. Now they had to hold the weight of unspoken things. The submitter describes nights spent replaying short phrases Nate had said, "They'll find a way to keep going, and if anyone goes looking, say I left." They wondered repeatedly if telling the truth would have mattered. But telling whom? If Nate had been right, and his warnings were about a project protected by layers of classification and administrative disinterest, then the act of disclosure might have had consequences beyond the family's control. The submitter admitted to holding both anger and admiration, anger that Nate had left them with questions, admiration for the fact he had tried in his way to act on what he'd seen. In the final pages of the submission about Nate, the tone turns inward. The submitter writes about grief that is complicated by doubt, about the way secrecy erodes not just facts, but the capacity to trust one's own memory of a person. Was he brave? They ask. Was he deluded? Did we fail him? These are questions without easy answers. They are the real ache of the story, that the person who once taught you to fix things left behind a problem that could not be solved with a wrench. It's tempting to move from Nate's story to legal theories or grand conspiracy rhetoric. The submitter resisted that. They framed it as what it was, a family left to pick through small signs and official silences to decide how to hold a memory of a complicated person who vanished when he tried to act. The submitter didn't claim knowledge of a cover-up. They claimed an emotional truth. Nate's death felt like an ending that could have been prevented if someone had listened sooner. Whether that's true or not remains a matter of public record versus private belief. The submitter lived with both at once, and then the narrative turns to Theo, which is to say to a different kind of loss, one that is less about secrecy between a citizen and an institution, and more about the stealthy way a young person can be eroded from inside a family by influences that are loud on the internet and quiet in the kitchen. Theo's story, according to the submitter, begins with a familiar portrait of adolescence gone sideways. A teenager isolated by depression, doing poorly in exams, feeling like the odd piece in a family puzzle. Therapy and a stable part-time job had started to pull him toward the surface. He joined a shooting club, which for a while functioned as a place where he could channel focus and feel competent. He made friends. He learned to aim. For a moment, the submitter says, it felt like a rescue for a kid who'd been losing ground. But people who are vulnerable can sometimes become targets for other people's agendas, and the submitter's account is explicit about that process. Theo's shift wasn't immediate. It came as a series of small changes that, when you look back, form a clear pattern. He began to spend more hours online. His sleep schedule shifted. He stopped joining family dinners. When he did speak, his sentences were shorter, sometimes weirdly scripted. The submitter noticed the change in the same way they noticed the way a plant doesn't quite look right. First a pale spot, then more. He withdrew into the kinds of corners the internet makes safe for certain voices. Gaming lobbies, private chats, message threads where older, more confident people offered attention and praise. Grooming, as the submitter describes it, is rarely explosive. It is often the slow calibration of someone giving a vulnerable person the thing they crave: acceptance, significance, a role. For Theo, according to the submitter, the path went from flattery to suggestion to gradual normalization of a risky or criminal worldview. The people reaching out may have started as sympathetic voices, who later offered him a sense of belonging and eventually a plan that felt like an extension of that belonging. The submitter says Theo began to answer less to his family's questions and more to the private messages that came at night. The shooting club itself became, in the submitter's telling, a hinge point. On its surface it was a hobby, but the submitter noticed that Theo started to come home with new friends, older than him and intense in a way that made the family uneasy. There were coded phrases in the messages Theo left on his phone. There were references to favors owed and duties to a wider group. The father, busy with work and already scarred by prior family crises, tried to be a figure of authority. They had an argument, shouting in a way that left bruises on both sides. Theo, the submitter writes, left that night and was not the same when he returned. What followed in the account sent to the channel was the kind of escalation families fear: patterns of secrecy, late-night absences, and a growing antagonism toward law enforcement and adults who asked too many questions. The submitter described a time when they confronted Theo about where he'd been. He shrugged and said only, "It's none of your business," which, for a teenager already learning to compartmentalize radical friendships, was enough to hide the rest. Then came the raid. The word raid is heavy. Armed police entering a house is the stuff of nightmares for people who live in homes where the people at the table are supposed to protect one another. According to the submitter, the day the police came, it felt unreal. There were officers in tactical gear. There were questions asked in a voice that did not soften for family members. Theo was arrested. The submitter says the charges were severe: allegations of planning to import drugs, firearms, and explosives for a criminal gang. These are the things the police reportedly said they had evidence for. The court files, the submitter claimed, later confirmed charges consistent with those allegations. Court in Theo's case became not a path to reconciliation, but a widening canyon. The submitter described the proceedings as odd and cold. Theo refused to cooperate. He refused to show remorse in a way that the family says suggested loyalty to the gang outweighed any sense of regret. In open hearings, according to the submitter, he sat almost expressionless, eyes shuttered from the cameras and the people who once loved him. The judge imposed an adult prison sentence. The submitter's family tried to understand what in Theo's life had flipped a switch, but their attempts at contact, letters, arranged visitation, pleas at the start, were met with a silence the submitter calls disappearance by appointment. One of the recurring things the submitter returned to was the paradox of loyalty. Theo, a young man who once needed help and comfort, now seemed to have been swallowed by a code that made cooperation with authorities the ultimate betrayal. The submitter says the group that groomed him prioritized secrecy and a perverse idea of honor. In the submitter's telling, when Theo refused to cooperate, it was both a criminal posture and a tragic surrender of family bonds. He had become, in effect, someone who could no longer be reached by the people who had once changed his diapers. The family tried interventions. They hired a therapist with experience in de-radicalization. They spoke to probation officers. They wrote letters that attempted to meet him on his terms, short, non-judgmental, full of small verifiable memories. But those attempts were blocked by the same structure that had pulled him in. Theo's refusal to accept help from outsiders was, according to the submitter, reinforced by the group's ideology. Someone who sought leniency or turned state's evidence was socially dead to them. This is the chilling mechanism of many criminal networks. They not only recruit, but they regulate dissent. Over time, visits dwindled, letters were returned, phone calls were infrequent or filtered through prison bureaucracy. The submitter describes the sense of loss as something less like death and more like erasure. Theo was physically alive, but emotionally absent. The family had to make space for both the legal reality, he had been convicted, he was serving time, and the personal reality, which was a continuous, small grief for a boy they had loved. There were practical consequences too. Financial strain from legal fees, the social stigma of having a child in adult prison, the painful conversations with other family members about who was to blame. The father, who had once stood between his children and the world, carried a private guilt the submitter writes about in detail. Did he fail as a parent? Were there signs he had missed? After all the other stories, Braden's aggression, Nate's secrecy, Theo's slide into a criminal orbit read to the submitter as a third, complementary narrative about how families can lose their children in different ways. The submitter also dwelt on the nature of online grooming and the peculiar way it can reshape identity. Theo was, the submitter emphasized, not a bad kid in a categorical sense. He had vulnerabilities that made him susceptible to combative, ideological reasoning. He had been lonely and found an online family that offered him an identity. The submitter was careful to distinguish description from judgment. They warned listeners that the line between recruitment and coercion is sometimes thin. The family had to live with the knowledge that the person who once came to the dinner table was now choosing, in effect, to remain a stranger. The emotional fallout bled into everything. Relationships within the house were strained. Siblings exchanged reproaches that had the thinness of grief. Friends took sides. Church and community networks offered a mix of sympathy and awkward avoidance. The submitter said they felt the town watching, as if Theo's actions had rearranged not just their family, but the social geometry of their neighborhood. There is a particular loneliness in that, they wrote, the sense that your child's crimes are a public object you wear like a scarlet letter. But the deeper loneliness for the submitter was watching Theo become someone unreachable and feeling both anger and a hollow parental love that never diminished. Throughout all three stories, the submitter folded into the narrative a recurring refrain. How ordinary things, locking a bedroom door, fixing a carburetor, joining a club, can be the pivot around which extraordinary danger twines. Sibling relationships by their nature are complicated. They are where loyalty, jealousy, imitation, and the need for identity meet. In Braden's case, it was a betrayal through violence and theft. In Nate's case, it was secrecy whose consequences rippled outward. In Theo's case, it was a slow grooming into criminal loyalty that effectively erased him from his family. Each story has its own architecture of harm, but they converge on the same human aftershock. Those closest to us can become the people we fear most. The submitter's conclusions are not grand or conspiratorial. They are modest and bruised. Each account ends with a list of small losses, sleep disturbed by the past, holidays rearranged around absence, a parent's hair turned grayer, relationships that cool into polite distance. For the submitter, the three sibling stories are less about the sensational headlines we imagine, and more about the quiet, enduring damage. Trust eroded, family roles rearranged, the ongoing worry that the next crisis could start with a knock at the door, a whispered warning, or a message in a gaming lobby. I want to be explicit about the limits here. These accounts came to the channel as submissions. The descriptions of crime, secrecy, and alleged wrongdoing are rooted in what the submitter says they experienced. Where the submitter alleges criminal acts, I've qualified those claims in the way the submission requested, framing them as allegations or as the family's belief. The channel is not an investigative body. We report what people share with us, and we try to respect their stories without converting them into certainties. There are lessons the submitter hopes listeners will take, and they state them plainly. One is about listening, noticing small shifts in behavior and addressing them honestly before small things harden into patterns. Another is about institutional opacity, When someone in your life talks about fear of powerful institutions, it leaves families in a terrible bind between loyalty and the moral imperative to speak up. Their third is about the internet and influence. The precipice of radicalization is often quietly crafted in private messages and online praise, and it is not always easy to spot until someone is already enmeshed. If you take away anything from these stories, maybe let it be this. Family bonds are powerful, but they are not immune to being twisted by violence, secrecy, and outside influence. The people who know us best can also be the ones who hurt us most, intentionally or not. Healing from that kind of harm is messy and slow. It rarely fits the tidy narrative boxes we see in true crime specials. There are therapy appointments and attempts at reconciliation, and sometimes there are legal records and distances that never close. The families who live through these events carry both grief and a complicated accounting of their own choices. Before I close, I want to reiterate something important. The channel has presented these stories as they were submitted. Where crimes were alleged, I have used language that tracks the submission's claims. I have not presented allegations as proven fact. If any listener recognizes elements of these narratives in their own life and needs help, please reach out to local support services or emergency contacts in your area. If this series of stories touched something, if the part about a locked door, a brother's silence, or a teenager's sudden withdrawal felt familiar, consider sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a story like this, we accept submissions by email. I can't promise investigation, but I can promise to treat it with care. Thank you for listening to these 3 disturbing sibling stories you didn't know were true. If you want more narrations like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. You can also support the channel through Patreon for extended interviews and written transcripts of submitted accounts. I read every email that comes in, and sometimes the simplest thing, someone being heard, feels like a small step toward making sense of the senseless. I'll leave you with a thought the submitter returned to at the end of their message. Families survive by inventing rituals of repair, but those rituals need accountability too. Keeping a house together should not require sacrificing the safety of one child for the comfort of another. We owe that to each other, siblings, parents, partners, because the cost of silence can be higher than we imagine. Until next time.